This episode of iFanboy is sponsored by GoDaddy.com. Use coupon code iFanboy to get 10% off all your purchases. And by Netflix. Go to www.netflix.com/iFanboy to get a 2-week free trial at Netflix.
This week on iFanboy, we're looking at the art and career of Mike Wieringo.
Hey, welcome to iFanboy, the video podcast for the comic book site iFanboy.com. My name is Connor. I'm here with
Ron.
And a special guest this week, we've got Augie DeBlieck from Comic Book Resources sitting in with us.
Thank you, Augie, for joining us.
It's great to be here in the studios.
Yes. So the reason why we wanted to invite Augie into the show this week, who's a friend of the show and a big fan of Mike Wieringo.
Yes, indeed.
We wanted to, we've previously on a couple other shows, we've taken a look at a creator and his body of work, and his or her body of work, I should say, and their careers. Unfortunately, Mike Wieringo left us. He passed away this past summer, which is very, very sad because he's one of our favorite artists.
Yes.
But we want to take a moment to kind of celebrate his career and take a look at the work that he did and just kind of talk about it. And we've spoken to some other folks who worked both with Mike and were fans of Mike, and we'll hear from them throughout the show.
Right.
But it's really, he was, like I said, one of my favorite artists of all time. He's one of yours?
Yeah, definitely one of mine, especially as the years progressed and got better and better. But he's one of the first artists I actually can remember following even when I first started reading comics.
Yeah. What was interesting is that he kind of broke into the business late in his professional career. I think he was like in his 30s.
He was, in his 30s or so. Got a late start out of college, basically, and backed his way in. Not backed his way into the industry. He found his way in and got some pretty high-profile assignments right from the start.
He did, and he started kind of right around the time that I think we all really started getting into comics in that early '90s kind of period. And what was interesting was that you'll see throughout his body of work, his art style really kind of began that a kind of art style that's very prevalent today.
The hybrid cartoony style.
Exactly.
And when he first started, I don't remember anybody else drawing like him. So when he came out a book, it was just like, boom, this imprint was put on it. He started off really with DC, was where he caught my eye on Flash and on Robin. Yeah. And his Flash was with Mark Waid was just amazing.
Mike was one of the first guys, I think, when he started on Flash for DC and really began developing as an artist, and to incorporate what we would now call a manga sensibility, although I don't think that's exactly where he got it from. He got it mostly from old Japanese cartoons, the anime side of things.
I came into the Flash in the late '90s by reading the trade paperbacks of Ringo's run, and to asterisk his nickname, he's affectionately known as Ringo. So, and he kind of defined what the Flash looked like to me. The idea of this like big-jawed, kind of sleek, almost kind of a shiny shine to the costume.
It's a little more bubbly than what we're used to at the time, because back then it was the Image era. '93 was when Jim Lee was at the top of the industry, McFarlane and all the rest. And here comes Mike Wieringo with a more Disney-fied style. Before the days of Joe Mad and all the rest would come in, everything looked like an anime or a manga book.
Right, exactly. And I
love the Wally with the big sideburns. I mean, you probably like that too, but it's just he had his own look. He didn't draw just like Wally as a dude with red hair. It was like Wally had a face and he had a look to him.
And he's paired with Mark Waid, who wrote that very long run on the Flash. And he really kind of revitalized, I think, that title, which is kind of, and you probably know this as the DC guy. I mean, Barry Allen had a very large and looming reputation, and then he died in Crisis.
Right. Well, there was a large period of time with Wally before Mike came on the book. I mean, he came on. It had been around for a while, but it wasn't like. It wasn't a buzz book until Waid came on, and he partnered with Wieringo, and it was a must-read book.
One of those moments where we all know Mark Waid is a great writer, but where the art and the writing really kind of made it, like you said, a book that you had to read, and it was definitely one of those attention-getting ones.
I think what you found in Flash and what comes through in all of his work, but really Flash is where he first really blew up, I think, for most people, is there's an overriding sense of everyone talking about how much fun he had drawing comics and how much he loved them, and that comes through in every panel. I mean, it's just like Flash is bursting through it all. There's just like a sense of joy to the whole.
Yeah, the sense of energy and speed, and in a way that is kind of, I guess, stylized, like kind of almost can be described as manga, but it doesn't feel like manga.
No, it's not.
Yeah, I mean, you use speed lines, but all his books, and I've read a lot of them, especially recently before we taped this, is there's an energy on every page. The characters never never stop moving. They never stand still. Even when they're talking and discussing things, they have great emotion on their face.
Yeah.
So there's never a dead page in any of Ringo's books.
His characters, were sort of cartoonified down to a fairly simplistic seeming couple of lines and large eyes and sort of stylized hair and these sort of renderings. And that kind of made him stand out from the pack at the time, all of whom were more or less trying to draw like Jim Lee or trying to draw like Rob Liefeld. So he really stood out just by virtue of the fact that he was doing something different. And then also, even from the get-go, while he got better at it over time, from the beginning it was pretty clear that this was a guy that was trying to tell a story rather than just do big, flashy pin-up shots or action shots of the various characters. That he knew how to pace a story and pace a page and move a camera around and would draw backgrounds and would draw environments, and his characters would act, which a lot of guys at that period, again, they had two expressions, the gritted teeth and the open mouth, and that was really the range of emotion or the range of expression you could get out of any of their work.
When researching for the show and looking back at his career and everything, I didn't know he worked on Robin.
He did. He worked on Robin for a short time.
Yeah.
After Flash, went to Robin, and then he brought the same style and all the good stuff in his art to Robin. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a bit of a change. Tom Grummett had been one of the original Robin writers, and Grummett draws very lean and sort of athletically muscular characters.
I
and they're
remember
tall. Robin seemed a little too tall, and Grummett drew him, but under Wieringo, he's sort of the same thing. He's sort of
He seemed more like a kid.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's almost like
big floppy hair, and he had
And looking at what he did on Robin, I see the inspiration of what
Yep.
Todd Knock did on Young Justice from the
Oh yeah,
Ringo.
It's kind of like the big
Robin.
feet and it's just Robin. When you see this art, he looks like a teenager. Not just a little adult. And that was, he brought the same thing to Flash with Robin. Not as long of a run. Not as influential, but
I mean, Flash, when you think about it, Flash, he was only on for about a year or so, from 80 to 93ish or so. And then Robin, I think, was about a year off and on. I mean, never really, Fantastic Four later on, which we'll get to, was really the only book he ever did that lasted a fairly long time.
Yeah. And it's funny because he said it because for the mark he left on that Flash, the whole line of Flash books, because he pretty much redesigned Max Mercury. Did he help invent Impulse? Did he help create
Impulse, he drew the first issue and designed the character. Yeah.
Exactly. So he defined the look of the Flash line for the rest of the 90s and into the 2000s. But like you said, he was only on it for about a year or so. So it's amazing. But then shortly after his DC work, of course, as creators move about from company to company, he did some work for Marvel, where he worked on Sensational Spider-Man.
I had been working on the Spider-Man books for about a year and a half and struggling through the Clone Saga, and I was working on Web of Spider-Man and Spectacular Spider-Man. Dan Jurgens was leaving Sensational, and they had asked Mark Waid if he would come in and take over. With Mark was going to come Mike Wieringo, but Mark wasn't going to be able to make it for a month, and they asked me if I would do a fill-in book with Mike to start it out. As luck would have it, for me, Mark opted out of the whole thing, other commitments and things like that. And when they asked Mike who he wanted to work with, I was lucky enough that he said my name.
Talk about a character whose style fits Wieringo's style. It's Spider-Man. I mean, he's like Spider-Man is a character that's constantly in motion, constantly in action. He doesn't stand still. He jumps around. He swings.
Yeah.
He is also a character that really likes being who he is and has a lot of fun and joy. So that's a perfect match of character and art.
I think Mike was a quintessential Spider-Man artist, and he had good runs on the book twice, but in both cases sort of in the off to the side book. He did a nice long run, he and Todd, on Sensational, which was a good fun book, but it was like the fourth of the 4 Spider-Man books. There was Amazing, there was Spectacular, there was I forget what the others. Webb was around, but I think that book had replaced Webb, and must have been Peter Parker Spider-Man, or adjectiveless Spider-Man at that point. One or the other. He was one in a field of 4, and the youngest in a field of 4. So it wasn't the same thing somehow. In some intangible, doesn't really mean anything, but does kind of way.
I think Sensational Spider-Man was also important when looking at his career because of the creative team. It was his first time working with
Todd Dezago.
Todd Dezago, who wrote the Sensational Spider-Man stories, and they hit it off as a creative team, which led further on their careers to their creator-owned work of Tellos.
Yeah, in fact, you can see a lot of the building blocks for Tellos in the Sensational Spider-Man, because there's some magical, mystical fantasy elements wound into Spider-Man, and there's some character designs even that look a little similar at the same time.
You can see the groundwork being laid.
You can start to see the genies showing up in Spider-Man.
So there's a dude in a Spider-Man costume, which is weird.
So this is the Tellos Colossal edition that recently just came out, and it collects the entire run. And I really think it was published by Image Comics, and this is the first volume. It's not just but this is one of those titles that was really, really special, and I don't think has gotten the notoriety it deserves.
So it doesn't.
No, it didn't when it came out. It doesn't now either.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Tellos? What's the
Tellos is a fantasy story, basically. It's got little bits and pieces of everything from the Joseph Campbell type stuff to the Star Wars type stuff to the Lord of the Rings influence you'll see in there as you go along. But basically, it's about a boy and his friend who's a big, huge talking tiger
with a sword.
With a sword, yes, with a sword, living in a fantasy world and having these grand adventures. And there's this overall storyline about how the Tellos world is going to end, and how Jarek the boy is the one, because every fantasy story has to have the one who can fix all of this stuff. And so the two of them end up on this grand adventure to try to save the world from this really nasty bad guy. Yeah. And there's great. It's got everything. It's got blimps. It's got pirates. It's got shadow jumper creatures. It's got talking frogs who have a lisp, of course. It's got a little of everything in there, and everything you'd want Wieringo to draw, and you saw him draw on his blog especially. Yeah. It's all in there in that book, and it only lasted, I think it was 10 issues, maybe 12 issues before it went away because it didn't sell well. And I think it's definitely the highlight of his career for sure.
Mike and I always loved fantasy. It was one of the things we always talked about doing. It was something that was going on in a lot of the anime that he was watching and sending me constantly. And this is before DVD, so we were constant. There was VHS tapes showing up in my house every other day sometimes. Oh, I watched this, you gotta see it. We always wanted to do fantasy. We loved animals. I'm sure that's known to everyone that Mike was a huge animal lover, and I was too, and the idea of having some anthropomorphic characters was very attractive to us. So we kicked around a couple of ideas and talked about an epic saga, and as we did that, there was one Sunday afternoon that we always talk about that we had a phone call that lasted 4 hours where we just hammered out the whole thing. We knew what was going to happen. We knew a lot of, the basic story. And then it was my job to come back and to trick Mike, to try to surprise him with the way those things happen, to get the characters together and then bring them to some of these points that we had stopped at in the most surprising way, so that Mike would always be excited about it. The idea of Tellos being this patchwork world of all different kinds of landscapes and things was so that Mike would never be bored drawing a background or drawing these new characters. And I wanted a vast cast so that, for example, the end of issue 3, issue 4 picks up someplace totally different. Just because not that Mike was getting bored or anything. He was having a great time, but I wanted to mix it up, so we changed the scenario a little bit. So the idea was that there was going to be this overstory that was going to be this boy who was finding out that he was, in fact, the chosen one. I mean, that's the classic in every story. Luke Skywalker and all the way back. But we wanted to get there in a different way. It's a lot of archetypes, but we just wanted to mix it up and change them around a little bit.
Tellos Colossal is a great, in this kind of, in this period of omnibuses and absolutes and stuff like that, it's definitely up there with them, and it collects a great series that really is probably the work, conjecture, but he's probably was most proud of.
Yeah.
That story is going to come out in the movie. There is a company that had approached us, and we had signed on an option with them for them to do it, and they are in development of it, so I'm hoping that it continues, but with Hollywood, anything can happen at any time. When Mike passed away, his brother became the executor of his estate and my new partner, and Matt and I had been friends previous to that anyway, through Mike, and so now we all know that Mike would have wanted Tellos to go on. For the longest time, while Mike was under contract to DC or Marvel, we would talk about getting more Tellos done. And Mike was not the fastest guy on the planet, but he figured maybe he could get a few pages done a month. So he was going. One of our dreams, one of the plans, was to have him do. In that Tellos ends up with all the characters scattered across the lands. They really have solo adventures. Coming back is the next story arc. And one of Mike's and my plans was that Mike would draw Jarek coming back, and his little story. And he comes back to the world, and he's amnesic again. He doesn't know what's going on. And so he's coming back, and they're all gravitating together, but they all have different stories in how they're evading the evil that's now setting upon Tellos. And so the idea was that Mike would draw Jarek in his adventure, and we would get some of our other friends and heroes to draw the other characters, so that you would have a jam of 6 issues, and we would still be able to get the story out there and bring them all together so that Mike would be able to draw the last issue with all the characters finally together again. But we just dreamed of people like Paul Smith and Michael Golden and Kevin Nolan and Art Adams and Walt Simonson to do these different characters, and so now that's kind of our hope, our dream, is to see if those guys will have the time, and a lot of them have already said that they would, so we will see.
Wieringo maintained a blog that he updated pretty much almost daily. I mean, if not every
daily or 3 days a week.
And he'd throw up his thoughts, and he'd throw up sketches and things like that, and it really gave you kind of like some insight into his process and how he thought of it. And the guy, I mean, like a lot of comic writers, he loved the comics as a storytelling mechanism. But superhero books can be very limiting in terms of what the kind of stories you can tell, because the costumes and the based in reality and stuff like that. Yep. So Tellos really struck me as a different type of story that can be told via comics that we don't have enough of in the industry. This kind of fantasy, kind of kids, all ages.
It's the kind of stuff, if you look at the stuff Wieringo loved, just starting at the Disney cartoons, but also going to the European comics, that kind of stuff that he always talked about in the blog, and he did a lot of sketches for the blog based on the European comics. A lot of stuff you see over there we don't see in America these days. Yeah. I wish they would translate them for us, because I'm not that good at French. And the books are expensive to import.
Especially if you can't read them.
Yeah, I can do pigeon French. I'm good at that. All those influences are in there, and the stuff he loved on the blog is what he drew all the time. He drew, the rocket ship girls, and he drew the anthropomorphic creatures, and then every now and then he'd throw in a redesign of a classic costume just for fun. But all the good stuff, and again, like I said, it's the stuff you don't see in North American comics these days, and hopefully, maybe as the trade paperback world explodes, maybe we'll get our chance to see it at last.
But Mike was his own worst critic. He was never quite certain about what he was doing and whether it was good enough or whether it was any good at all. And
Mike was very hard on himself about things that we would look at and just gush over, and his brother and I would always say, "It's done. Move on. Go." But I don't think I've ever worked with an artist who said, "Wow, this is great, you're gonna love it." They're all very tough on themselves.
Periodically, like clockwork, twice a year, where he would go through like a low period where he'd be very down himself in the work, and he wouldn't be producing as much as he'd want. He'd be very frustrated and you'd have to kind of work him through those periods and reinforce him and try and lift his spirits and so forth. On the other periods, he'd be up and he'd be fun, and he'd leave you voice messages in the voice of Borat and so forth. So he would have his ups and downs like anybody else.
Mike's blog, it's still up for anybody who's never seen it. It is a treat to go through and see the stuff that he drew, that he would just sketch up as his morning ritual of trying to get himself going. And a couple times he would wake up and he wouldn't know what to do. And he and I talked, not every day, but a couple times a week. And there were times I'd get a call early in the morning and he'd say, "What should I draw? What do you know? What do you got? What do you like? What are you thinking about?" And sometimes it would be something that caught his fancy, and other times he'd That sucks. I'm moving on.
In the early 2000s, he at DC he did a run of Superman. I think it was.
Yeah, it was
it
brief.
Adventures of Superman or?
It was one of the. It was,
One of the
yeah, it was
Superman
brief
titles.
Adventures. Yeah.
Yeah, and with Joe Casey writing. And actually, we're lucky enough, Augie owns some original art from that run. So
Yeah.
can we take a look at that? Or,
Yeah, sure. These are
Yeah.
the couple of pages I have.
Yeah.
It's nothing terribly fancy. Superman's not on here, but you can definitely see the ability he has. There's two things you can see in here. First of all, he can draw architecture.
Yeah.
A lot of people can't draw buildings these days anymore. And second of all, it's just a simple plain page. There's lots of different angles he's drawing the characters from. Characters have different facial expressions. It's more than just the 2 or 3 other artists can draw. Yeah. And you get a real chance to see, how he can change his point of view, even though it's a talking head scene, basically.
And I think it was interesting. It was interesting balance at that time period because you had Ringo on one of the books and Ed McGuinness on one of the other books.
Yeah.
Who Ed McGuinness was very much, I think, influenced by Ringo. And actually, Tom Brevoort told us a bit about that.
I mean, you could certainly see. I remember one vaguely embarrassing moment. And this would have been around '96, I guess. It was. I'm trying to remember. I think Mike must have been doing a cover for me for a trade paperback or something. It was around the time he was working on Spider-Man. I'd gone up by the fax machine, and these pages had been faxed in, and there were pages to this Wolverine annual with Wolverine and Red Ronin. And I had occasion to talk to Mike. I said, "Oh, Mike, I saw these pages you just sent in. These Wolverine pages. They look great." They weren't Mike. They were Ed McGuinness's earliest stuff. So clearly, Ed, while he's grown and done something, it was pretty clear looking at that very first job that he was obviously looking at what Mike had been doing. I know Mike always felt when he was doing Superman that certainly they had Ed on the main book and they had Mike on Adventures, and they were going for a certain look and a certain style, and somehow in Ringo's head he felt like, oh, they want me to draw like Ed McGuinness, and I don't know if I can do it. And I don't know that that's necessarily because I didn't speak to anybody at DC. I only heard whatever Mike was talking about in that period. I don't know if that's specifically what they were asking of him, but that was sort of the mind trap he had fallen into on that assignment, feeling like, oh, I gotta follow Ed. I don't know his characters are bulkier than mine, or I don't know, how to do this. And it was kind of the flip side where he should just do what you do, Mike, and it would have bbeen fine, and nobody would have complained about it.
As in recent years, looking at the work that he's done, he came back to Marvel and got paired up with Mark Waid again, his former collaborator on The Flash, to work on a very long run on Fantastic Four.
Yeah, it lasted, was almost, 3 hardcovers worth, so just about 3 years. He was gone for a small portion of it. Howard Porter did some art, and we won't go into that whole,
some behind-the-scenes stuff, yeah.
Some behind-the-scenes ugliness that happened, but him and Wade revitalized that book for many
Absolutely.
people.
I don't normally buy that book, and I bought it when they did it together. I stopped buying when they left. It was a fun Fantastic Four book.
It was one of those things where, like, Fantastic Four as a title is a book that I always tend to read in collected editions or in trades or in omnibus edition, and I wonder, why aren't I reading this on a regular basis? And this is one of them where I read the hardcovers, and I'm pissed at myself that I wasn't picking this up, because just looking at the emotion and the energy and the feeling that Ringo gave to the art, and it just and the thing is that if you look at what he did with Flash and what he did with Spider-Man, even with Tellos, Fantastic Four is a different kind of animal. It's very kind of scientific and Cosmo-y and stuff, Cosmos-y kind of, and he nailed it. He just, he really made it look amazing.
We'll talk about a guy that can draw the Thing, as a big rock guy, and then it's perfect. It's sort of a Tellos vein, and then there's all science and the cosmic stuff, and then the personal human emotions. This is like almost more perfect for him than any of the other books.
Yeah, it's a great follow-up to the Tellos book. If you want to see something kind of like Tellos a little bit, but more mainstream, more super heroic, it's definitely the book to go to, because it's got everything in it.
And just look at the art; it's beautiful. I mean, if you see the arc of his talent from going back to Justice League Quarterly, where he first broke in through Flash and Robin, Spider-Man, and Tellos. By the time you get back to here, it just blows everything off the page.
I'm getting these hardcovers, and it's quickly becoming a favorite of mine. So I'm glad that the work is out there and it's a print for us to see.
When I first called Mike to do Fantastic Four, we talked 2 or 3 times, and his big concern was he just said, "I don't think I can do it. It's a book. It's got all this Kirby history behind it, and there's a way it's supposed to look, and this sort of big abstracted Jack Kirby black shapes and things. I just don't think I can do that." And what I basically told him was, Mike, when you came out to Flash, you came in around issue 80, and for 79 issues, everybody that drew that book tried to draw it like Jackson Guice, who started it, and that was the look. And you came in, and you did your Flash, and your Flash looked nothing like Jackson Guice, and everybody that's been on that book since, and everybody that's drawn that character in all the other titles since then have tried to draw it like yours. Do that on Fantastic Four. Draw your Fantastic Four. Don't I'm not saying throw Kirby out completely, but don't worry about making it look like Jack or like John Buscema or John Byrne or whomever. Do your Fantastic Four, and if you do it right, what you'll find, hopefully, is as the years go on, other people are gonna pick that up. Define it by yourself, and that, whether that actually helped him or not, he came on and did the book. So it worked on that level.
I was just totally impressed by the art on Fantastic Four, and I didn't know this until today, but you own a couple pages of that art. So I love the show and tell aspect.
This is perfect. I mean,
so tell us about these. These are,
and this is special.
Yeah, this I'll explain to you. This is a little behind-the-scenes process work for those of you who, like me, are process junkies. But I think it was during the era of Tellos, actually, that this all started. I think Tom Grummett may have started the whole thing. But what the artists would do is they'd do tight pencil work. They'd just pencil the entire page. They'd scan it in, and they'd email it to their inker. And their inker would print out the pencils onto a blue ink board, basically, and they'd ink over the blue ink. So what you end up with is you have the inker's pages and you have the penciler's pages, which are untouched by any inks. So you can see in the Fantastic Four pages, they're really tightly penciled. Yeah. They're beautifully drawn, and you get to see just the original line that Ringo in this case had drawn, and you get to see just every little detail in there. I think these are probably a couple of the more beautiful pages in my collection.
These are tightly drawn.
Yeah, this page here from Fantastic Four featuring Dr. Doom, introducing the new Dr. Doom storyline in the beginning of their run, is just the crowd scene and the depth of field and and it just shows that he really was a master at these tight kind of pencils and the
Why don't you explain, Augie, why this page works so well?
There's a couple of reasons for this. I mean, one, you can just, when you first look at it, you'll see there's a whole bunch of different people in the crowd shot, and no two look alike. I mean, you have skinny people, you have heavier people, thank you. You have hair-challenged people, you have hairy people. But the thing I noticed in this page in particular is that it's a page of Dr. Doom just walking through a crowd. And when you look at the lines and the way Ringo drew, and there's only 3 panels on this page, but when Doom appears in each of the 3 panels, there's always either some dead space around him or the perspective kind of shifts, the one-point perspective in this panel's case. Everything on the panel leads your eye into where Dr. Doom is.
Well, especially this top panel here, every line of focus, it converges right on Doom in the middle.
Yeah.
There's just all the perspective lines go whoop right to Doom.
He's fairly small on the page. I mean, there's people in the foreground who are much bigger, twice his size, but he's the one you point out to. And I'm sure when Paul Mounts colored it, he made sure to probably brighten up Dr. Doom a little bit or stand him out a little.
And even in the smaller pages, on the smaller panels, too, you see it just the perspective still goes right to Doom.
Well, it's almost like a comic representation of that Goodfellas zoom in tracking shot, because what you've got is this wide shot and Doom is small, and the next panel Doom is a little bigger, and the people, it's kind of zooming in on him, but you get this sense of motion just through 3 panels. It's amazing. A
lot of comic artists like to take a whole page and 4 widescreen panels now to keep zooming closer and closer, and you see them powers a lot, for example. But this is a case where it's not just one panel repeated 3 times.
You get the sense of time.
You definitely
and what you can see from these panels is that not only is his art, when it's all put together, the elements, the inking, the coloring, it's beautiful, but these are beautiful pencils.
These essentials in 10 years are going to look great. The black and white reprints, seriously, they will. They'll be amazing.
A lot of art really is enhanced by the coloring. And the coloring techniques are so advanced now. They really it's such a part of the art. But this, he doesn't need colors.
In fact, you can see, I think these Miss Marvel covers will show. I think these are colored right off of his pencils, and they have a slightly softer quality. You could definitely ink, or you can definitely color, I should say.
His art is not. I don't think his art benefits from that quality. I think his art is crisp, and it needs that hard line, whereas this is sort of too soft. That's just mine. It's one man's opinion.
But after the Fantastic Four run, he kind of, towards the end of his career, he kind of moved the bat a bit. He did a couple issues of Miss Marvel recently, which I actually dropped this title right before he came on. I was pissed at myself. And he had just started working with Peter David on Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man.
That didn't work out too well.
No. Once again, the victim of timing. And it's really kind of upsetting that way, because it was he came up. Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man was Peter David's kind of Spider-Man title that started right in the middle of the other.
The other.
I bought the first issue because I loved his art so much. great, he's doing Spider-Man with Peter David. I like Peter David. And then the second issue was right in the middle of that horrible crossover, and I dropped it.
Right.
Never to come back again.
Right.
Yeah, they were filling issues almost right away on that, and just it was the end really quickly. And he moved on to do something else. A couple filling issues here and there, but never got started on the next big thing.
One of the last assignments that he was offered and he took, and I remember us having the discussion about it before the editor, Aubrey Citizen, called him and offered it to him, and I kind of thought to myself, it's your dime, you make the phone call, but there's no way Ringo was going for this. He was approached to do a 3-issue run with Matt Fraction on Punisher War Journal, and Mike went, yeah, okay, great, let me do that. I've never done that before, I'll try. And they sent him the first script, and he just could not penetrate doing it. He just couldn't. He must have drawn the first page 6 times, and it was just never right to him. It looked too nice for the Punisher. It didn't feel right, and in the end, he ended up having to call the editor back and say, I got to turn this back in. I can't do it. So he struggled with that. He and Warren Ellis talked a lot about doing a project, and there was actually a thing that Warren was developing to do with Mike that maybe would have been the thing that would have filled that niche for him. But it all comes out of Mike's personality. Mike wasn't the kind of guy who wanted to do those sorts of comics, and late night at conventions and in the hotel bars or whatnot, as people talk shop, he would lament the fact that comics were quite as dark as they were or as grim as they were, and he really wanted to do not soft, kiddie, sparkles in the sky kind of comics, but rousing adventure comics of the sort that had been around when he was a reader and so forth, which is why he was a really good fit with Wade and with Todd and guys that kind of shared that outlook.
He's left a great legacy behind him. I think he will be forever immortalized, at least in my list of top artists, and through these works, like Fantastic Four and Tellos and Flash and stuff like that. It was very sad news this summer when he passed, but the comic industry mourned. But
but he does leave behind a great legacy.
Yeah, there's a lot of books here, and a lot of them are still in print, thankfully, so you can still pick them up.
Yeah, so definitely, if you haven't checked out Mike Wieringo's work, go check it out. I mean, it's like we said, it's some of the best art you'll see. So Augie, thanks so much for coming visit us, talk about Ringo.
No problem. Thanks for having me, guys.
So where can people find you?
They can find me on the web at comicbookresources.com. Just go to the pipeline column, pipeline.comicbookresources.com. I'm sure it's going to appear above my head somewhere.
Probably below.
Below, yeah. Sorry. Asterisk. That's the best place for your weekly fix of my commentary.
The asterisk is going to say, don't go there.
Look below. So thank you again.
And you also have a weekly podcast.
Yes, thepiplinepodcast.com is my contribution to the comics podcasting world, and I look at the week's new books, and I let you guys do the reviews later.
It's a nice little bookend.
Yes.
To our audio podcast.
I try to glom onto your hits.
Yeah. So if you have any questions or want to share your thoughts about Ringo or anything, you can shoot us an email at contact@ifanboy.com. We love hearing from you.
You can also give us a call, 1-888-FANBOYS, which is 326-2697. You can leave us a voicemail about Wieringo or anything else you want to talk about.
And head over to ifanboy.com, where there's going to be a post about this episode, and we're going to try to put up as much art and stuff like that as we can. And you can post your thoughts about Ringo's work, or you can head over to our message board at revision3.com/ifanboy. There's a link to the discussion forums there, and you can talk in the free-for-all forum. It's a good time. So
I think we got in trouble at the Baltimore show. Scott Kurtz, of course. Scott and Cully Hamner and Mark Wade and Tom Brevoort and I sat on a panel and told some stories on Mike, and it became a roast after a while because Mike's sense of humor was just wonderful, and we would laugh about the silliest, stupidest things. There's lots and lots of stories of Mike. He was a funny person. He really enjoyed, he loved comics. He loved the people who were involved in comics, and loved life, loved animals, and he was a great guy.